Welcome back to ThinkTech. This is Keeping the World Company. I'm Jay Fidell. Our guest today is Jean Rosenfeld, an historian. We're going to talk about the implications of Prigozhin's death in a fiery plane crash just yesterday. Welcome to the show, Jean.
Thank you, Jay. Wonderful to be back.
So this has all kinds of implications. It's not just that Putin likes to do KGB type assassinations, and he's been doing that for a long time. In fact, it's not just him, it's built into the DNA of Russia, if you will. And here we have a very ostensible, mysterious crash, but I think we're going to find out soon enough that A, Prigozhin died in the crash, and B, it was a state crash. It was a Putin crash. And it's got to have implications on how powerful or maybe embarrassed Putin is, and all the things that he does and wants to do. Again, he's cut out the middleman, maybe a number of middlemen here, so that he can run the state operation all by himself. And certainly, we knew that Prigozhin betrayed him, had a rebellion, a mutiny with him, which he could not tolerate for his own image in Russia and beyond. So, you study history and you study, what do you want to call it, state violence and terrorist violence. What do you get out of this mysterious assassination? Is there any question that Putin is behind this?
President Biden said yesterday, and echoing what he'd said before, that Putin's the man in control and there's little that happens in Russia that he doesn't know about. And he had to wait and see because he didn't have all the intelligence data on it. But we can pretty much deduce from that the current thought is that indeed Putin was behind this.
Yeah, and now there's going to be an investigation of the air crash. And I'd like to make you a side bet, a $5 side bet, Jean, that they don't find anything that is probative or relevant to how this plane crashed. You want to bet me?
Oh, no. No, I agree with you. We'd have to find some other gullible person to take that bet.
Here's a larger question, and I think we should spend a minute on it, and that is, does this make Putin more powerful? Because this is clearly intended not only to kill Prigozhin, but to show the world they should be afraid of him. They could be next. If you want to betray Putin, you're assassinated. So does this make him more powerful, more feared, or perhaps less feared?
His first line of defense is domestic, not international. So he was at a celebration of the 80th anniversary of a battle that the Russians won against the Nazis, I think in 1943 at Kursk. He gave it was very ritualistic, and he gave a speech. And what he's doing right now is trying to shame Russian men into fighting in the military. So we know he's got some problems there with recruitment because he's deliberately going around and he's using these patriotic associations to overcome opposition on both sides. On one side, there have been some internal resistance attacks in Russia. But we know on the other side, even more powerfully, that Yevgeny Prigozhin was the poster boy for the military in Russia. And his greatest fear, I would imagine, which is true of any dictator, is that his military ranks would split and there would be a coup attempt. And when these things happen, they happen underground. You don't see them happen. They develop over time, but all of a sudden, things will go down. And you notice that at the same time that this accident occurred and Prigozhin was presumably eliminated, that a general that was thought to be sympathetic to Prigozhin, a very powerful general who had once shortly been in control of the Ukrainian war, Sergei Surovikin, is resting, quote unquote, somewhere in Russia. We don't know where he is. but he too is being sidelined or eliminated. And he has a history of coup attempt. In 1991, just before the Soviet Union fell, Surovikin was engaged in a military coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. It failed, but then so did the state. It came down. And Putin knows this. So if you're a dictator, number one, you have to have support from the military and not worry about splitting the military, which Prigozhin was quite public in doing. And you need to keep the recruitment up among the men of Russia, because everything really rests on the domestic situation and the support for the war among the people that he needs to recruit to fight it, because he knows he's in for a long haul now.
It has the mark of a purge, doesn't it? Because Prigozhin wasn't the only Prigozhin person on that plane. 2 or 3 other people, maybe all the passengers. It was Prigozhin's plane, and his primary lieutenant was killed. Other people in his organization were killed. And Surovikin was not the only general who has been removed from power, maybe disappeared. So it seems to me that there is a purge, just as you say, and Putin is, reinforcing his control over the army and taking the middleman out, so to speak. That's a double entendre.
Prigozhin really did stage a coup. It was interrupted, but on his side, that was okay. And he at least somehow was not the best chess player against Putin in terms of what he did subsequent to that coup when he marched on Moscow. And Putin, I'm sure, noted that he was welcomed in some of the towns that he went through on the way, because, the Russian people have learned, I believe, to watch the tea leaves and to assess who is likely to be top dog and to ultimately win the chess game. So I think he saw signs that there were others, and particularly Surovikin, who was not a failed general like some of these other generals that have been removed, like Gerasimov. He was a very successful, brutal general. His nickname was General Armageddon. And Human Rights Watch had taken note of the rules of war that he had violated in Syria and brought it to the world's attention. So he was a strong man. And this came so close to Putin that, yes, there must be lines of weakness that have been papered over, and he could not let any agreement with Prigozhin stand, could no longer trust Prigozhin and his military affiliates. So he has now taken steps, and we have to sort of ourselves step back, as I'm sure he's doing, and see what's happening and where the tea leaves are going. Because the Russian people, if they see and sense weakness in his power, well, they'll flip to the other side.
Oh, you raise many questions. And by the way, he hasn't made a comment about the plane crash yet. He hasn't made a comment. He made no public comment about Prigozhin. It's this waiting to see, as you said. It's waiting to see how the public reacts, and before stepping back into the chess game. Very interesting moment. So, how does this affect the war in Ukraine? He's cut out the middleman. He's cut out the leader of the Wagner Group. Query whether the Wagner Group is now under his control, if at all, or maybe scattered throughout the Russian army. And is he going to be the commander? It sounds like he's taking more control in order to avoid this from happening again.
We can't get into the minds of the individuals involved, and we also have a cultural screen between us. We may think that Ukraine's culture is very similar to our culture or the UK's culture, but these are people that have been under extreme stress since the beginning of the 20th century, and who suffered millions dead in Stalin's relocations and famine that he induced in the breadbasket of Europe. The thing is, Ukraine is very valuable to both sides because it does produce a lot of food for the world. There's nothing else like it in Europe. And the Soviet Union wants that. Not the Soviet Union did want that, but Putin wanted that too. He doesn't want to lose Ukraine. As to what the Ukrainians are thinking at this point, they're thinking, I believe, how can we exploit what has just happened in Russia? How can we best exploit it? I just read something this morning that the Ukrainians have made some kind of a sortie toward Crimea, that they really, really want to cut Russia's ties with Crimea. Perhaps, maybe this is offensive to take the heat off on the Donetsk and Luhansk regions and make Russia split itself and feel that now Crimea is in play, which is major. And this will stress their military even more at a time when the high command is under question.
It's funny you should say that, because a couple of days ago, the Department of Defense made a public statement. They thought that the Ukrainians were focusing too much attention in their counteroffensive in Donetsk, and they ought to spread it out a little. It's really interesting what has happened, particularly after that remark. So, you make it sound, Jean, like he's not a psychopath, that he has reasons for what he's doing, as perhaps any autocrat, any Russian autocrat, even though they appear to be brutal war criminals, and they seem to be psychopaths, they have their own logic. Am I right? Is he a psychopath, or does he have his own logic?
Well, I don't have the credentials to answer that question, but more important than that is he is a rational leader. He is not governed by his mental failures or the diagnoses or anything like that. He's a very rational leader. And in terms of what motivates a dictator, they're sociopaths at least, if not psychopaths. Psychopaths are at the beck and call of their emotions, but a sociopath can be very, very cold and very, very deliberate and rational. And we have to accept that at least. Now, he has visions of Russia's role in the world. He has grandiose visions. And he has a plan. He has a global plan for a, quote, multipolar world to unseat the United States as what he regards as the hegemon, the one superpower. And his attempt to ally himself equally with China is a way in which he's trying to be a force multiplier for a new vision of the world as multipolar. He goes around the world and makes speeches through his Valdai Club and invites unaligned nations to see if he can create a bipolar split between the West and the East. He has a vision of governing the Eurasian continent. The problem is that China and he are no longer equal. He has the military superiority. China has the economic clout and the possibility of the future. But China, I don't think China wants war to interrupt its economic march towards superiority. And he's got a problem with China. Russia is, it isn't superpower potential by itself. That's his problem. So he's trying to attract Brazil and South Africa, India, and Iran, and other up-and-coming nations and economic powers to his side. His problem is that he doesn't, other than his military and his nuclear buildup. He really doesn't. Russia doesn't have the resources to lead.
Just to spend a moment on nuclear power, a part of the Sahel, that sub-Saharan belt across Africa from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, Prigozhin has been active in fomenting unrest there, in fomenting violence and coups, as we recently saw in Niger. So now Prigozhin is out of the picture. And Putin wants that. He wants control there. The Wagner Group helped him get and keep control there because there is gold, there's diamonds, and uranium there. And now Prigozhin's out of the picture. How does this affect the Africa initiative for Putin?
I think Africa is up for grabs. China's making initiatives in Africa. But what we're really seeing in a larger picture is this trying to divide the world into two. There's the United States and its allies. And almost every part of the globe is up for grabs because the Arctic is opening up. Half the Arctic borders are owned by the United States and its allies. The other half is owned by Russia, and it's been allowing China resources and access to the Arctic as well, because it will, as it melts, become a major focus of trade routes and military control. Then Africa is full of countries, some of which are mired in a kind of doldrums, and the other of which are advancing and have promise. So again, if you don't have enough power in your own domestic situation, you're going to reach out to other parts of the world that you can try to bring into your camp and control. But the problem is that China and Russia together would be formidable, but they don't seem to be able to really stay together. They're very wary allies of each other, and they're in competition in different parts of the world, especially China, which has been reaching out to Latin America, has been reaching out to the South Pacific, is making us have to play whack-a-mole in many parts of the world, which is very tough on us, especially when we have a domestic problem brewing here too.
Yeah. You spoke about the BRIC group, which China is a member, and they're meeting in South Africa right now. And Putin would have liked to gone there, but he can't go there because he'd be arrested if he left Russia. So he made some kind of internet appearance there, and what he said was pretty much what you've been saying, is that this war in Ukraine was started by the West. This is all the fault of the EU and the United States, this war. And again, he's trying to impose the blame and the division in the context of BRIC. At the same time, the Baltic countries are reacting. Poland said, some official, I don't know how high up he was, probably the foreign minister, he said that they don't trust Russia. They don't, and this whole affair with the assassination of Prigozhin makes them trust Russia less, and they have to be more careful, be more armed, be more ready for his aggression. And so in a way, the trust that Putin might have had I'm giving you a possibility, has been eroded by these continuing assassinations, not only Prigozhin, but the three women journalists in the EU who were poisoned only a few weeks ago because they were writing against Russia and against Putin. So I think there's a certain question about whether countries that might not have spoken against him in terms of whether you could trust him, there's probably also a certain amount of distrust that has been generated within BRIC itself. What do you think?
Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, All those countries have never trusted Russia for a couple hundred years. In fact, Poland and Lithuania had a very large empire between the Baltic Sea and the Balkan Sea. And Sweden at times allied with their actually Lithuanian kingship and against Russia. And in the Battle of Poltava, which took place in Ukraine, actually, Russia defeated Sweden, and the king of Lithuania had to leave. And it went back and forth for a few years. He was reinstated, and then he wound up in Alsace-Lorraine and embraced by France. So these countries know the culture and thought of the Ukrainians and the Russians as well. They are the canaries in the coal mine. Lithuania was the first Soviet socialist republic to stand up and after the coup in 1991 and declare its independence, which it had wanted for many years. There has always been distrust between Lithuanian patriots, Polish patriots, Ukrainian patriots, and Russia. This is nothing new. It's new to us. But the person to read about all of this is Timothy Snyder of Yale, who's been given doing some appearances on TV, and he's just absolutely the best in the United States to instruct us not only about the relationship between Russia and its near European satellites, but also our own domestic situation and how that plays into the equation, which is serious.
Yeah, Tim Snyder's lectures are on the internet. We can sign up for them and see his course on Ukraine. It's very interesting. All of that considered, the trust factor, the alliance to the extent that it has deteriorated with China and all that. Do you think that this particular assassination, which is really visible to the world, was a mistake? Did Putin have to do it? Couldn't he have done some other thing to, re-achieve his power? Or was it a mistake?
How could he avoid it? That's his weakness. He was forced to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Prigozhin forced him to do it.
You spoke about, the troubles we have in this country and the fact that Trump is the leader for the possibility of a nomination by the Republican Party, such as it is. And one of the comments he made recently, which really stunned me, he might say that he made it in the context of a joke, but I don't think that Trump makes jokes. He said that if worse gets to worst, he would move to Russia, which is, that's kind of almost predictable. If things really get bad, he'd skip his bail and run to Russia. And so, we have to ask the question, is if Trump wins and the guardrails are off, the Bill of Rights is no more. Representative government, the Constitution, the rule of law are all seriously jeopardized. Is he going to be an autocrat, such as Putin, using government instrumentalities to make war on his adversaries and opponents? Is that what we have here as a possibility, given the fact that, I hate to say this, that Putin has been so successful in dealing with his adversaries, including Navalny, who has a new 19 years tagged on to his prison term? I think one has to ask whether Trump would engage in the same kind of autocracy were he to win another term.
Well, of course, there will be an autocracy because of Schedule F, which was a plan that he was going to put into place with his second administration. Trump resembles no one more in history than Benito Mussolini. So to study what his potential is, study Mussolini. However, I am banking on the theory of charisma, which has been developed by Max Weber and others in the field of sociology, And according to the theory of charisma, Trump will not be president again, namely because he's a loser. If you're a charismatic leader, you cannot lose. You always have to win. You will always be challenged by other, quote, champions. And if you lose, and he's done nothing but lose, that's why it's so important for him to create these theories and lies, to create the perception that he doesn't lose, that he hasn't lost, that the only reason that he is still not on top is because greater forces, satanic forces, are working against him. And his following that buy into that are still a minority. So if our institutions hold and we have a general election for president that is intact, that isn't undermined, he will not be president again. However, that's not to say the danger has gone away, because he has now started a very bold movement by people who are very well armed, who can create mayhem and disorder in the United States. And there are other willing candidates in the so-called Republican Party, which is now a fascist movement. Trump has never said he was a member of a party. He's always said he's had a movement, and it's overtaken the GOP as it currently exists. And there are others in that party who would, in essence, perform very much like Trump. So until the Democratic Party gets wise enough and the media gets smart enough to continually point out that Trump has consistently lost and he is a loser, and to brand him with that name, and until they also expose what candidates like DeSantis, what their character is really like, and how they resemble Trump, Mussolini, and that type of character, we're going to be on, tenterhooks to see who actually trying to control the GOP. And hopefully, the Democratic candidates will pull us off. But nobody really has wised up to that fact. We've wised up to the fact that we have a fascist challenge in the United States, and the word is now used, which I'm happy about because I was using it back in 2015. But we haven't really learned how to counter it and to call it by name yet.
Thank you, Jane. Appreciate all those thoughts. If the country watched ThinkTech, if they could hear you now, that would have a huge effect. So we have to have you back. But let me ask you one last question. You describe a whole scenario about winners and losers in the United States and autocracy in the United States. Does that apply for Putin? You mentioned earlier that, yes, he could lose the confidence of the Russian people, but you didn't say where that took him, where it took them. Do we have another possibility of another revolution on our hands? What does that mean?
The Russian people are long suffering. They've been through revolutions. They've been through purges. They've been through horrible wars. They've suffered a great deal, and they've learned that, you can't just jump out there like a big hero and be bold and do this and do that, because the forces arrayed against you are too strong. Yes, they have institutions, but they're paper institutions. The de facto reality is power. It's a power struggle. So what they do, I believe, because I have read a few Russians on this, is they sit back and they watch. And then they try not to jump in until they're pretty sure that they have a good chance of prevailing. And, I think before that happens, the powers that be at the top will crumble and fight each other first. I think the military in Russia is not happy. The war is not going well. their people are being disappeared as well. Somebody cast his lot with Prigozhin, hoping Prigozhin stopped. He didn't have whatever it takes to carry out the coup. So there's going to be a reassembling under the radar for some time. And there probably won't be another attempt until the leaders feel that they can really prevail. They have a lot to lose unless that does happen.
Thank you, Jean. Jean Rosenfeld. So clear a picture. Thank you very much for discussing these things with us.